So this section, I'm having you read an essay that was published in the Atlantic by Ian Bogost. Bogost is generally, I guess you could say broadly, he's a critic of digital culture. But more specifically, he generally stays within the area of games and serious games and gaming. I guess he would be, on his academic side, you might say he's a gaming theorist or a critical scholar of gaming. And in this piece, he's asking us to say, to question whether algorithms are treated as if they are somehow godly or somehow supernatural. And that's how he starts it out with, and I think it's a clever way to start, to say, can you replace the algorithm with God in a particular sentence and have it still mean what it was intended to mean in the first place? This reminded me of a billboard campaign back when there was a search engine called Ask Jeeves, which eventually became Ask and then eventually died. But for a while they were trying to push this idea of Ask Jeeves. They bought billboards all over, and they had these sayings on the billboards like, the algorithm knows what you want for dinner, or what is the algorithm, or, ask the algorithm. Like, you really did put the algorithm in this godlike position. And so I think that's a really great example of what he's talking about, but also a very limited example. I think you could find another example, and we've hit this before, in the cases of Google and Facebook in particular, sort of trying to distance themselves from the output of their various algorithmic sorting processes by saying, it's not us, it's the algorithm, right? And we can't really tweak that, right? We can't change that, because then we'd be really involving humans in the process. We just have to kind of trust that the algorithm is doing this and it's not us. And if there's an error there, it'll fix itself, right? In other words, I think that idea is deployed strategically by digital culture type companies, platforms, that sort of thing, as an excuse for what they're doing wrong. It's also deployed strategically as a way of selling a particular item. I saw there's a new car that was designed by AI. I think the algorithm is probably going to be replaced increasingly by AI. And so it was a car that was designed by AI. And that's clearly, I'm sorry, but clearly baloney, right? It's not designed by AI. You may use certain processes, certain approaches, certain algorithmic approaches to design. There's no question that this is kind of infiltrating all different kinds of things we do, and engineering is definitely one of those, right? That engineering, nobody engineers with a slide rule and a drafting board anymore. That computers are deeply intertwined with what we do in any kind of intellectual process. And so, yes, of course, it was designed by some sort of processes that might fall under this general umbrella of AI. But here it's being used basically to market it as better because AI has helped design it. And that is kind of that God complex of algorithms there. But I do think he oversells it. I don't think that we really do this to the extent that he does. And I think he's drawing here a little outside of his normal métier of dealing with games, right? And moving into the broader question of criticizing digital culture. And he draws from Carr and others who do the same. And I agree with him that this can be over-exercised. I just think that it's a bit of a straw man argument that this is as generally done as he seems to think that it is. There are two other pieces here. One is that he sees this as metaphor rather than practical, right? So when we talk about algorithms, these algorithms are generally people all the way down, and so it's dangerous to kind of abstract them from that. And it's being used as a metaphor in the way that other previously used industrial processes have been used as metaphors in the past. So, we may have talked about the body as a machine. We have a long history of that, going all the way back to kind of Descartes and the spread of automata in Europe, and how people started to make biological metaphor, mechanistic metaphors for biology, and where you think of sort of the circulatory system as a set of pumps, or the neural systems as a kind of set of electrical connections, we have this tradition of using metaphors to think entirely throughout history. That's kind of how we think about systems, especially. We think about systems often in terms of more familiar models of systems that we understand. But I think you can take that too far. And I do think that the computer and algorithms in particular are a special case because they are universal machines. I mean, you could say that using the automobile as a metaphor, and he talks a little bit about this, that's a very limited way in which you can treat it as a metaphor. But when you're talking about algorithmic society, I think that there are enough connections there that it makes sense to say that we are talking about the ability to program various things. He brings up a work that many of you have probably already been exposed to, this idea of code 2.0, the comparison of code that is legal code and code that is computing code. And he says simply because those are homophones, but they're not just homophones, right? They're not just the same word for, they both are code. They both are ways of encapsulating a set of instructions. And it seems strange to me that he sees them as merely using the same word. They aren't. And that's certainly not the argument that's been put forward. And there's certain homophilies between these as well. There are structural similarities between the way they're used. And so it's, I think, more than just a metaphor in that case. It's very clearly connected, the idea of code as software and code as law. And so I think that that there is an inherent deepness here that is more than just kind of a metaphor. So to summarize, he's right and he's wrong. I guess you could summarize that about anybody, right? But I think he's right in that there are certain limited cases in which people are still presenting technology and particularly algorithms as a kind of infallible, again, godlike, and an infallible way of improving things. I think that in many cases, he's right that the actual labor processes of, a warehouse in Phoenix with people sitting there and hand checking whether the flagged content on Facebook, that a lot of that real human labor is hidden in the process of what is euphemistically considered an algorithm. And even in cases where the algorithm itself is doing that processing or that filtering, it's often based on having had people on Google Turk or hired and put into a warehouse do this kind of training of the algorithm. So a lot of that human effort and labor and time and the kind of we've talked about the acreage of actual computing power that's required to make these algorithms work. That's not really in a cloud. The cloud is a physical environment, so you can't just say it's a cloud, right? So I think he's right to highlight those, but I just don't think it holds together as a whole. I don't think that I think that there are some real differences between these and earlier uses of analogy. I think that there are some very real differences, that it's not always people all the way down. This isn't just kind of a chess player, the automatic chess player that's not an automatic chess player. There really are some pretty substantial changes in the way that filtering algorithms happen, and certainly in the way that artificial intelligence has advanced over the last 5 years. This acceleration, I think, is probably underplayed rather than overplayed. So I think that he's right in the specifics. He's right within bracketed contexts, but I don't agree with him on the broader sense. All right, thank you.